Her brother sold her like livestock to settle a gambling debt, and she had 3 days before she became the property of the most dangerous man in Redstone Crossing. Warren Holt didn't just own land, he owned men. He owned the law. And now he thought he owned Elara Voss. But a scarred stranger had been watching from the shadows, a man with nothing left to lose and a leather pouch full of gold. He wasn't offering rescue. He was offering a bargain, 1 year of marriage, and then her freedom. She said yes. That was her first mistake. Or maybe her only salvation. If this story pulls you in, stay until the very end, hit that like button, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this tale travels. The sunset bled like a wound across the Wyoming sky, painting Redstone Crossing in shades of rust and ruin. Elara Voss stood frozen in the doorway of the dusty lantern saloon. Her hands curled out so tight against her skirt that her nails left crescent moons in the fabric. Through the haze of pipe smoke and cheap whiskey, she could see her brother at the poker table. Daniel Voss, 26 years old, with the face of a man watching his own hanging. He'd done it again. She knew before he spoke. She knew from the way his shoulders caved inward, from the way his eyes skipped past hers and landed somewhere on the sawdust floor. She knew from the man sitting across from him. Warren Holt. Holt was perhaps 45, silver-threaded and immaculate, in a charcoal suit that had no business existing in a frontier town. He wore it the way a general wore a uniform, not as clothing, but as armor. His gold rings caught the lamplight when he drummed his fingers against the poker, felt patient as a vulture circling something that wasn't quite dead yet. 3 months, Daniel. Holt's voice was smooth and deliberate, the kind of voice that never needed to raise itself to be heard. 3 months I've extended your credit. And what have you managed to produce in that time? Daniel's glass trembled when he set it down. Mr. Holt, I need a little more time. Another week, maybe 2. $1,600. Holt rotated a cigar between 2 fingers, studying it with the mild interest of a man discussing the weather. That's what your foolishness has grown into. The original debt plus interest plus 3 separate loans you took against your sister's dowry savings. He looked up then, and his eyes were the color of January ice. I do believe we've exhausted the concept of time, son. Elara felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. $1,600. They could work the ranch for a decade and not see that figure. Their parents' land mortgaged twice over. The cattle herd already thin from last winter. The dowry savings their mother had stitched together over 20 years of lean seasons, all of it already promised, already borrowed against, already spent by a brother who couldn't walk past a card table without emptying his pockets. I can work it off, Daniel said, his voice cracking down the middle. Your mines, your timber crews, whatever you need, 10 years if that's what it takes. I have plenty of broken men willing to work themselves into the ground for pennies. Holt exhaled a ribbon of smoke toward the rafters. What I need is something more valuable. The way he said those last 3 words made Elara's blood go cold. Daniel followed Holt's gaze. It landed on Elara like a brand. No, Daniel's voice went gray and hollow. Absolutely not. She's my sister. You can't. I can. Holt's pleasantness never flickered. Let me clarify your position. You signed a contract witnessed by this town's magistrate and 3 upstanding citizens. Default on that contract and I own every one of them. The land, the livestock, every stick of furniture in that house your parents died building. He tapped ash onto the floor with ceremonious calm. Or your sister marries me willingly by Sunday. The debt disappears. I am in my own way a reasonable man. She's not property. Everything can be priced if you know how to look at it. Holt gestured to the man at his shoulder, a wall of muscle called Pike, who'd earned his name breaking mining strikes with a pickaxe handle and had never much cared about the distinction between persuasion and violence. Pike, Holt said pleasantly, tell Mr. Voss about the Hendricks situation. Pike's smile revealed the geography of a man who'd lost several arguments with harder men. Fella tried to run on Mr. Holt last spring. Found him 3 days later in a ravine outside of town. Sheriff ruled it an accident. He let a beat of silence do the rest of the work. Tragic how his horse managed to break both his legs before he fell. The piano player had stopped. The whole saloon had gone still. The way towns go still when the wrong kind of man is making the wrong kind of point. Everyone in Redstone Crossing knew Warren Holt's story. He'd arrived 5 years ago with Eastern money and a hunger that never seemed to get satisfied. He owned the largest cattle operation in 3 counties, the only bank a controlling interest in the mines north of town. Men who crossed him had a way of disappearing. The territorial sheriff was a man who cashed Holt's checks and asked no difficult questions. Daniel's hands were shaking so badly he knocked over his glass. The whiskey spread across the felt like spilled blood. That was when Elara found her voice. She stepped fully into the saloon, past the watching faces, past the held breath of a room full of cowards who'd learned to look the other way. She walked until she was standing behind her brother's chair, close enough that Holt could see her face clearly. "I'm standing right here," she said, "in case you've forgotten that I'm a person and not a transaction." Several people gasped. Pike's hand drifted toward his gun, but Holt merely turned to look at her, and what she found in his expression was worse than anger. It was appraisal. The slow, methodical assessment of a man taking inventory. "Miss Voss." He removed his hat, the gesture a perfect mockery of courtesy. "I apologize for the indelicate nature of this conversation. Your brother's poor judgment has created an unfortunate situation." "The only unfortunate situation," Elara said, "is that men like you are allowed to operate in the same territory as decent people." A ripple went through the room. Holt's thin smile didn't change. "Spirit," he said, replacing his hat. "I'll give you that. My previous wives all had it at the start." He let that sentence hang there, casual and terrible, a noose dressed up like conversation. Everyone in the territory had heard the stories about Holt's wives, 3 of them in 5 years. The first had died in childbirth, or so the official account went. The second had vanished one winter, supposedly fled with a traveling salesman, though her family had sworn she'd never leave without her daughter. The third had died in a riding accident 8 months into the marriage, a broken neck ruled accidental by the sheriff Holt bankrolled. All tragic, all convenient, all buried without justice. "I won't marry you," Elara said. Her voice was steady in a way her body wasn't. "I don't care what contract Daniel signed. I am not property, and I will not be bartered like a horse at auction." "Pike." Holt's tone remained perfectly pleasant. "See Miss Voss home. Make sure she understands the geography of her situation." He turned back to Daniel, and his voice dropped to something almost fatherly. "You have 2 choices, boy. Your sister walks to that altar willingly by Sunday, or I take everything through the courts, including her, and none of it happens willingly. Either way, the debt gets settled." He glanced once at Elara, and in that glance was something that made her understand exactly what had happened to those 3 women. One way is considerably less painful for everyone involved. "Don't you dare agree to this!" Elara grabbed Daniel's shoulder, trying to force him to look at her. "Daniel, look at me. Don't you dare!" But Daniel wasn't looking at her. He was staring at the table, at his empty hands, at the evidence of every bad decision he had ever made arranged in front of him like an accusation. When he spoke, it was barely a sound at all. "She'll be ready by Sunday." Elara lunged forward. Pike caught her arm like a clamp closing on wood. "You coward!" she snapped, twisting uselessly in his grip. "Daniel, you spineless, you can't do this. I won't let you." "It's done," Holt said, gesturing toward the door, with the bored authority of a man who'd already stopped thinking about the question. "Pike, see the lady home. And Miss Voss," his eyes found hers across the smoky distance. "Let me be very clear. You can walk to that altar Sunday, or I can have your brother's body dragging behind my horse Monday. Your choice." The next hours moved like a fever dream. Pike deposited her at the small ranch house 3 miles outside of town, his parting words wrapped in the cotton of false courtesy. "Mr. Holt expects cooperation, miss, for your brother's sake." Inside the dark house, Elara collapsed against the door. Her whole body was shaking, not just her hands, but somewhere deeper, some structural thing. Through the window, she could see Redstone Crossing's lights twinkling in the distance like indifferent stars. A town full of people who would attend her wedding and say nothing, who would watch her walk to an altar toward a man who collected wives the way other men collected debts, and they would call it proper and go home to their suppers. She thought about running, taking her mare, and riding hard for Cheyenne, for the railroad, for anywhere that wasn't here. But Holt's men would track her within days, and Daniel would pay the difference in blood. She thought about the small derringer her father had given her mother, still in the bedroom dresser. One shot, one way out before Sunday. But that still left Daniel at Holt's mercy, and despite everything, despite his weakness, despite the magnitude of his betrayal, he was still her brother. The boy who'd held her hand at their parents' graveside, who'd promised to protect her always. Some promise. Elara moved through the house by memory and lamplight, past furniture, worn smooth by years of use, past the single photograph of her parents on their wedding day. Her mother had been beautiful once, before the frontier had ground that beauty down to something harder and more honest. Would that be Elara's fate too? Worn down by degrees inside a house that was more cage than home, until Holt decided she was worth more dead than alive. She was standing at the kitchen window staring at nothing when she heard the horse. Her hand went immediately to the shotgun beside the door. The rider dismounted in the yard with the economy of motion that came from either military training or very hard living. He was tall and broad-shouldered in dark clothing that made him almost invisible against the night. When he removed his hat and stepped into the spill of lamplight from the window, she saw a weathered face, lean and angular, with several days of dark stubble and eyes that carried the specific exhaustion of a man who'd seen too many things he couldn't unsee. That's far enough. Elara leveled the shotgun at his chest. The stranger raised both hands slowly, palms out. Miss Voss, I mean you no harm. Everyone means me no harm today. State your business or ride on. My name is Seth Calloway. I was in the saloon tonight. His voice was rough like gravel shifting under wagon wheels, but it held steady. I heard what Holt did. Then ride back to town and tell everyone how entertaining you found it. Bitterness had sharpened her voice to something she barely recognized. I'm sure it'll be the talk of the territory. Another woman sold to the highest bidder. I'm not here to gossip. He took one careful step forward, moving into the fuller fall of the lamplight. Up close, she could see the scars, a thin line across his cheekbone, another disappearing under his collar. A man well acquainted with violence, but something in the way he held himself suggested it was violence survived rather than violence sought. I'm here to make you an offer. I've had enough offers for one night. Not like this one. He met her eyes directly, no flattery, no performance. I can pay your brother's debt. All of it. $1,600 in gold delivered to Holt tomorrow morning. The shotgun didn't lower. Why would you do that? You don't know me. You don't know Daniel. I've been watching Holt operate for the better part of a year, Seth said. Watching him grind this town down to nothing. Watching him take what he wants and call it business. His jaw tightened. I've got the money. I've got no use for it beyond keeping my ranch running. And I've got no patience left for men who buy women like they're buying cattle. So this is charity. No. He shifted his weight, and she noticed then that he favored his left leg, an old injury healed crooked. It's a trade, a bargain. There it is. 1 year, Seth said quietly. You marry me legal and proper for 1 year. After that, if you want to leave, you go free. I'll give you traveling money enough to start over anywhere you choose. Denver, San Francisco, back east, wherever you want. Elara stared at him. And during that year, what exactly would you expect from this partnership? You'd help run the household, assist with the ranch accounts. I'm not much for paperwork. In return, you'd have a roof, food on the table, and my word that I won't touch you except as necessary for appearances in town. He held her gaze without flinching. Separate rooms, no expectations beyond basic respect and basic cooperation. She studied him for a long moment, trying to find the seam in it, the place where the trap was hidden. What do you get? She asked. Men don't make offers like this without wanting something. For the first time, something moved beneath his controlled expression, something dark and painful that surfaced briefly before disappearing behind the wall again. Let's say I understand what it's like to be owned, he said. And I understand what it's like to wish someone had offered you a choice when you had none. The words landed differently than she expected. Not dramatic, not rehearsed, just the weight of something true. Outside, wind moved through the pines, rattling the shutters. Sunday was 3 days away. 3 days until she walked toward Warren Holt and whatever fate had swallowed his 3 wives before her. How do I know you're not worse than Holt? She asked. You don't. Seth's honesty was almost startling in its directness. You don't know me. You don't know if I'm telling the truth. All you know is what I'm offering 1 year with a guaranteed exit. That's more than Holt is offering you. He held her gaze. You've got until tomorrow noon. I'll be at the livery stable in town. You show up, the deal stands. You don't, I'll assume your answer is no, and I'll ride on. And if I take my horse and run tonight instead, something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Then I hope you make it. He replaced his hat and turned toward his horse. then paused, one boot already in the stirrup. For what it's worth, Miss Voss, I saw the way you stood up to Holt tonight. Looked him in the eye when everyone else in that room was staring at the floor. A beat of silence. Would be a waste to see that courage buried next to his other wives. He rode off into the dark. Elara stood in the doorway long after the sound of hoofbeats faded, the shotgun still in her hands, her mind working through the mathematics of impossible choices. She didn't sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table with the lamp burning low, watching stars wheel past the window, cataloging every reason this was reckless and foolish and probably a trap she wouldn't see until it closed around her. She was still sitting there when Daniel stumbled through the door near dawn, reeking of whiskey and the specific shame of a man who knows exactly what he's done. Elara the First, he stopped when he saw her face. Don't. She stood, exhaustion making her movements stiff. Don't apologize. Don't explain. Don't make promises you stopped being able to keep years ago. I thought I could win it back. I thought, you thought about yourself. She moved past him toward the bedroom. Like always. Where are you going? She paused in the doorway, her back to him. To make the only choice I've got left. The livery stable smelled of hay and horse and worn leather. Elara arrived at 11 on her mother's old roan mare, a single carpet bag holding everything that mattered. Her mother's wedding ring, her father's silver pocket watch, 2 dresses, a photograph, and the Derringer. She wasn't sure she'd ever have the nerve to use. Seth Calloway was already there, leaning against the stable wall with his horse saddled and his hat pulled low. He straightened when he saw her. His expression remained carefully neutral. Miss Voss. Mr. Calloway. She dismounted, her hands not quite steady. I have questions. Ask them. This ranch of yours, where is it? 40 miles northeast. High country up near the Iron Bell Range. Closest neighbor is 12 miles off. It's remote. He paused. But the land's good. Water year-round. Decent grazing. Part of her recoiled from the thought isolated wilderness with a stranger. Another part recognized it for what it was, distance. Distance was safety. Distance was the one thing Holt couldn't buy his way past. What happened to your last wife? His jaw tightened, but his eyes didn't move from hers. Never been married. Came close once. Long time ago. He was quiet for a moment. The woman I wanted to marry didn't get a choice in the matter. Her father sold her to settle a debt, same as your brother's doing to you. Her husband beat her so badly she lost the sight in one eye. Something went flat and cold in his voice. Took me 3 years to track her down. By then she'd gone somewhere too far inside herself to come back from. The raw pain in those words hit Elara somewhere deep and unguarded. I'm sorry, she said. Don't be sorry. Just understand when I say I know what ownership looks like, I'm not speaking theoretically. He pulled a leather pouch from his saddlebag and weighed it in his palm. 1,600 in gold. I pay this to Holt. Your brother's contract is settled. But Holt won't let you go easy. He'll find another angle, another leverage point that's done. The only way to protect you permanently is marriage before he can file any legal claims. Seth met her gaze steadily. After the year, I'll have papers drawn up in Cheyenne's clear terms. An annulment, if you choose it, and a settlement $500. Enough to start over anywhere. $500, more than she'd ever held in her life. A train ticket east, a boarding house while she found work. A new life clean and untangled from all of this. Why me specifically, she asked. If you have this kind of money, you could have helped anyone in this town. Seth was quiet for a long moment, staring past her toward the mountains visible against the morning sky. Because I've been watching Holt destroy people for a year and calling myself a coward about it, he said finally. Because I've got more money than I need in a ranch that's too quiet for one person. And because, he stopped, then continued more carefully. Because when I saw you look him in the eye last night, instead of breaking the way he expected, I thought maybe you deserved a chance to choose. Even if the choices are bad, it's still a choice. That's something. It wasn't rescue. It wasn't romance. It was almost cold in its practicality, and somehow that made it more trustworthy than any flowery promise could have been. Elara took a long breath. I need your word on one thing. Name it. My brother. He's weak, and he's made terrible choices, but he's the only family I have left. I need your word you won't hurt him. Seth considered this for a moment, then he nodded. I won't touch him. But he can't come to the ranch, and if he brings trouble our direction, that protection ends. Agreed, and she extended her hand. 1 year, separate bedrooms, freedom at the end. He shook it. His grip was firm and calloused. 1 year, he confirmed. We do this today, get the license, find a preacher, make it legal before Holt knows what's happening. Then we ride out tonight. He'll be furious. Something dangerous crossed Seth Calloway's face. Let him. The county clerk issued the marriage license with visible curiosity, eyeing them both the way people eye a development they can already feel is going to generate conversation for months. Seth Calloway was known in Redstone Crossing as a man who kept to himself, and here he was marrying a woman he'd presumably met in the last 12 hours. The preacher was harder. Reverend Meister initially refused impropriety. He said, lack of proper courtship, the appearance of haste. Seth solved the problem by setting $50 in gold on the man's desk. We're both of legal age and both consenting, Seth said flatly. You can perform the ceremony and take that donation for your congregation, or we ride to the next county and give their minister the money instead, your choice. Calder performed the ceremony. It took less than 10 minutes. Elara wore her best dress, which wasn't saying much, and Seth stood beside her in his trailclothes hat in hand, his expression unreadable. The Reverend's wife and the county clerk served as reluctant witnesses. Do you, Seth James Calloway, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? I do. Do you, Elara Ruth Voss, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? She looked at him then, this stranger with scarred hands and careful eyes and a leather pouch of gold that represented the only exit she'd been offered. He didn't pressure her, didn't lean in, just waited steady and patient as if the answer was hers to give in her own time. I do. Then by the power vested in me by the Wyoming Territory, I pronounce you man and wife. Seth leaned in and pressed the most formal, briefest kiss imaginable to her cheekbone, barely more than a breath, and then straightened to sign the certificate with quick, efficient strokes. Just like that, Elara Voss became Elara Calloway. They were halfway to their horses when the shouting started. Calloway Warren Holt stood in the middle of the street, Pike and 3 other men flanking him, his expensive suit doing nothing to hide the fury that had stripped away every pretense of civility. In his fist was the leather pouch Seth had delivered that morning. You think you can interfere with my business? Seth moved slightly, positioning himself between Elara and Holt without making a production of it. His hand rested loose at his side, close to his gun. Nothing was interfered with. I paid the debt legal and proper. Daniel Voss's contract is settled. The debt was a means to an end, you fool. The girl was promised to me. The girl, Seth said quietly, and the quiet of it was somehow more dangerous than shouting, has a name, and she's married now, legally. He nodded toward Elara. Show him. Elara pulled the still damp marriage certificate from inside her coat. Holt's eyes went to it, and something in his face fractured the smooth, powerful surface, cracking along seams she hadn't seen before. You draw on me in front of these witnesses, Seth continued, and you'll die in this street. Your money won't buy your way out of a fair fight. The street had gone absolutely silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Pike's hand hovered near his weapon, but Holt's reputation for winning depended on stacked odds, not fair contests, and something in Seth Calloway's stillness suggested he understood the difference between a man who talked about violence and a man who'd survived it. Holt's face cycled through rage and calculation and landed somewhere between the two. This isn't over, Calloway. Get out of my way. Seth's voice was quiet and final. My wife and I are leaving. They rode out of Redstone Crossing at a gallop, and Elara didn't look back once. Her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. She just married a stranger, defied the most dangerous man in the territory, and burned every bridge she'd ever stood on. She should have been terrified. Instead, for the first time in 3 days, she could breathe. They rode northeast as the light changed, following trails that seemed to exist more in Seth's memory than on any map. He set a hard pace for the first few hours, putting miles between them and Redstone Crossing, before the urgency eased and they slowed to something more sustainable. They stopped once at dusk to rest the horses. Seth built a small, efficient fire and shared jerky and hardtack from his saddlebag. They ate mostly in silence, which Elara found she didn't mind the way she would have expected to. We'll reach the ranch tomorrow afternoon, Seth said, feeding the fire. It's rough country, but the cabin's solid. I built it myself 3 years ago. Elara studied the fire. What made you come to Wyoming? Same thing that brings most people, trying to outrun the past. He poked at the embers. Didn't work, but at least the scenery is better. The woman you mentioned, Sarah. She watched his face carefully. What happened to her in the end? He was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. She's alive, he said finally, living with her sister's family in Nebraska now. She doesn't remember me, or she pretends not to. Either way, I stopped trying to make her. He stared into the flames. I couldn't save her, but maybe I can give you what she never got, a chance to choose your own direction. The honesty of it, uncomplicated, unrehearsed, touched something in Elara that she'd been keeping carefully guarded. Thank you, she said quietly, for today, for all of it. Thank me in a year, Seth replied, when you're standing somewhere you chose to be, and I've kept my word. They made camp properly after that, bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire, proper distance maintained. Elara lay looking at the stars and tried to calculate the odds that she'd made the right decision. The mountains rose black against the night sky, enormous and indifferent, and somehow reassuring in their indifference. Whatever happened next, she was here. She was alive. She had a year to figure out the rest. Tomorrow she would see the ranch. She would begin the careful work of learning who Seth Calloway actually was beneath the scars and the silences. And somewhere behind her in Redstone Crossing, Warren Holt was sitting in the dark planning. She fell asleep thinking about that and dreamed of open country that went on further than the eye could follow, and no one at all telling her where she could or couldn't go. Seth Calloway's ranch appeared near mid-afternoon the following day, and Elara's first sight of it came as a surprise she hadn't expected. She'd been bracing herself for something barely habitable, a trapper's shack maybe, or a sod house half sunken into the hillside, the way struggling homesteads tended to be. What she found instead was a sturdy log cabin set into a natural clearing, the mountains rising behind it in a long, dramatic sweep of pine and granite. A barn, a corral with solid fencing, a chicken coop. The beginnings of a vegetable garden put to bed for the coming autumn, modest but cared for. The whole place had the quality of something built to last. Home, Seth said, simply dismounting. He didn't embellish it or apologize for it. For the next year, anyway. Inside the cabin was one large main room, kitchen table, stone fireplace with two doors leading to smaller rooms off the back wall. The floor was swept clean. The shelves were organized. There was a wood pile already stacked by the hearth, cut with enough forethought to get through the next month easily. Bedroom's on the right, Seth said, setting her carpet bag inside the door. It's yours. I'll take the room on the left. It's smaller, but I don't need much. The bedroom was simple and clean. A bed with a real mattress, a dresser, a washstand, a window facing east toward the mountains. Elara sat on the edge of the mattress and took in the dimensions of what had just become her life. The entire world she'd managed to salvage fit in the carpet bag at her feet. It's not much, Seth said from the doorway. Swingyuong. It has a lock, she said. It does. Door has a lock if you want it. She turned to look at him. I don't think I'll need it. Something shifted in his expression, not quite surprise, but close to it. He gave a single nod. I'll get your mare settled in the barn. Dinner's usually simpler around here, but I'll see what I can put together. He disappeared and she heard his boots on the porch steps. Elara unpacked, slowly placing her mother's ring on the dresser top, her father's watch beside it. Through the window, she could see Seth in the corral, brushing down both horses with steady, unhurried strokes. A man who paid attention to small things, who built fires that lasted and fences that held. She pulled out the Derringer last and looked at it for a long moment. Then she put it in the top drawer of the dresser beneath her spare dress and closed it. The first week passed in careful orbits. Seth rose before dawn each morning, slipping out to check fence lines or tend the cattle that grazed in the high meadows. He left coffee warming on the stove and biscuits wrapped in cloth, simple gestures that required no conversation and made none. Elara spent her days exploring the cabin, taking inventory of the pantry, mapping the rhythms of a place that was now technically supposed to be home. When they spoke, it was in brief, practical exchanges the root cellar needed. Organizing a fence post on the north side had worked loose. The stew was on if he was hungry. Words that filled space without asking anything of the space beneath them. She told herself this was exactly what she'd agreed to. A business arrangement, nothing more. But the silence pressed against her chest in the afternoons, and she found herself cataloging things she hadn't meant to notice. the way Seth's shoulders gradually unknotted when he sat by the fire after supper. The worn book he kept on the shelf beside his chair read so many times the spine had gone white. The scar on his left-hand index finger to wrist that spoke of something edged and close. On the 8th day, Elara broke the pattern. Seth came in at dusk dirty from a long afternoon digging post holes and stopped short in the doorway. The table was set properly. Actual plates, the good tin cups, a venison stew, steaming in the serving bowl, fresh bread she'd coaxed from the temperamental oven. Wild flowers from the creek bank in a jar at the center. He stood there looking at it with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What's all this? Dinner?" Elara ladled stew into his bowl and kept her tone casual. "You said I'd help run the house. I'm running it. Sit down before it gets cold." He hesitated, a man not accustomed to being waited on, or perhaps more precisely a man not accustomed to being cared for, and then lowered himself into the chair. For several minutes they ate without speaking, but the quality of the silence had shifted. Less avoidance, more two people learning the geometry of sharing a space. "This is good," Seth said, finally mopping up the last of the gravy with a heel of bread. "Really good." "My mother." Elara refilled his coffee. She believed a person should be able to make something decent out of whatever ingredients were available. Sounds practical. She was, right up until the influenza took her. The words came out matter-of-fact old grief, worn smooth by years of carrying it. "She made my father promise to take care of us. Made Daniel promise to look after me." She moved the stew pot back to the stove. "Didn't do much good in the end." Seth was quiet for a moment. "Your brother," he said carefully, "you think he'll try to reach out?" "No, and I don't expect him to. Daniel is very talented at running away from the consequences of things he's done." She came back to the table and sat. "I used to make excuses for him, said he was young when our parents died, said he was overwhelmed trying to hold the ranch together alone. But the truth is simpler, he's just weak. He's always been weak. Being weak isn't the same thing as being evil." "No," Elara said, "but it can do just as much damage." She met his eyes across the table, and something in the directness of it seemed to catch him off guard. "You promised you wouldn't hurt him, and I'm grateful for that," she said. "But I don't need you to defend him. I've spent enough years doing that myself." Seth nodded slowly, accepting this without argument. Fair enough. They finished the meal in more comfortable silence. When he stood to clear the dishes, Elara stopped him with a gesture. "I'll handle cleanup. You've been working since before sunup." "So have you." "Not digging post holes in rocky ground." She shook her head. "Go sit, read, take one evening off. I promise the kitchen won't collapse." Something passed across his face so quick she nearly missed it, that might have been the beginning of a smile. He settled into the chair by the fire and opened his book, and Elara washed dishes in the basin, watching him from the corner of her eye without meaning to. He read with complete absorption, his weathered face softening slightly in the firelight. She noticed the way his shoulders continued to drop inch by inch as the evening deepened, the tension leaving him like water draining. A man who spent all day on guard, who finally briefly allowed himself to put it down. "Can I ask you something?" The words escaped before she'd decided to say them. Seth looked up from his book. "Go ahead." "Why do you live all the way out here? You have money, skills. You could have settled closer to town, had neighbors." She leaned against the kitchen doorframe. "Why choose this kind of isolation?" He closed the book, marking his place with his thumb. "Because out here nobody asks questions," he said. "Nobody expects things from me I can't give. I can work hard, sleep reasonably well, and not have to pretend to be something I'm not." "What would you be pretending to be?" He stared into the fire. "Civilized, friendly, safe." The words came out measured. "All the things people want to believe about their neighbors." A pause. "I was a soldier during the war. Fought for the Union in places that don't exist on any map anymore because we burned them off the page." His voice went flat and careful. "I followed orders, came home and discovered I couldn't stomach civilization anymore. Couldn't stand in a church or sit in a parlor making small talk about the weather while knowing what I'd helped do to other people's towns." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and unadorned. Elara thought about her father, the way he'd woken screaming from dreams he never described in daylight. The way the war had come home inside him and lived there quiet and ruinous until the influenza finished what it had started. "My father was in that war," she said. Different side, same nightmares. Same war from opposite ends of it. Seth's mouth compressed. 2 days at Shiloh, boys dying while calling for their mothers. He laughed once brief and bitter. I was 17. Thought I understood what war meant. Took about 4 hours to cure me of that. Is that where you learned to shoot the way you did in the street? He looked at her. Survival skill. When you're outgunned, speed is the only advantage available. A beat. I don't enjoy it. I'm not looking for it. But when someone threatens what's mine, I finish it quickly. What's mine? The words should have sat badly given everything that had brought her here. Instead, they felt different, not possessive in the way Holt's ownership had been possessive, but protective. A line drawn not around her, but around the space they shared. This far, no further. Holt won't let this go, she said quietly. You know that. Let him come. Seth's expression hardened in a way that was not anger, but something colder and more considered. Out here, I've got every advantage. I know every trail, every approach, every weather pattern. A man who wants to bridge trouble to this ranch is welcome to try. He met her eyes. He won't like how it ends. She believed him. There was something in the certainty of it, not bravado but cold calculation, that suggested he'd already thought through the possibilities and made his peace with them. I don't want you to die protecting me, she said. That wasn't part of the arrangement. I'm not planning to die. I'm planning to live. He rose and stretched the firelight, catching the angles of his face. That's the whole point. A pause at his bedroom door. Get some sleep. Tomorrow I want to show you the property properly, every trail you'd need to know if you ever had to navigate it alone. He disappeared into his room, and Elara sat by the dying fire listening to the cabin settle around her. Wood contracting in the night cold. Wind through the pines, the creek running somewhere below the clearing, steady and indifferent. A month ago, she'd been watching her brother gamble away her future. Now she was here in this isolated, impossible place with this scarred and careful stranger, and the strangest part was that it felt against all reasonable expectation like safety. Not because she trusted Seth Calloway completely. She wasn't that foolish. But because for the first time in years, she was going to sleep without wondering who would find her if she didn't wake up. The days developed a rhythm after that. Seth showed her the property boundaries, teaching her to read the terrain the way she'd once learned to read her mother's face for what it was actually saying beneath the surface. He introduced her to the cattle herd, explained the system of trails connecting the ranch to the surrounding high country, demonstrated which streams ran year-round and which dried up by August. In exchange, Elara reorganized the pantry into something that made sense, mended the curtains on the front windows, and taught Seth that his biscuits, which he'd apparently been eating for 3 years without complaint, had the density and texture of fieldstone. These are fine, he protested, staring at the results of his latest attempt. Your standards were low. She pushed him aside and took over the bowl. Watch. You have to work the dough gently. You're treating it like you're wrestling livestock. He watched her hands with the focused attention he brought to everything practical, and the next batch came out edible, and the batch after that was nearly right, and the small victory seemed to please him out of proportion to its significance. She noticed things about him the way you notice things about weather, not all at once, but gradually as patterns emerged. He touched the scar on his cheekbone when he was thinking hard. He preferred his coffee strong enough to dissolve uncertainty. He could lose himself in a book for hours, but if she spoke his name, he surfaced instantly, no lag, no irritation, just attention, complete and unhurried. He had nightmares. She could hear them through the thin wall between their rooms. A sharp intake of breath, then pacing the floor, creaking softly as he walked circuits around the main room, until whatever he'd been dreaming about released its grip. She learned not to mention it. 3 weeks in a late summer storm rolled through the mountains with the subtlety of a freight train. Temperatures dropped 20 degrees in 4 hours. Rain came in sheets, then turned to sleet, then back to rain. The world outside the windows reduced to gray static. They were effectively trapped inside together for 3 solid days. Seth taught her to play poker, running her through the mechanics with patient precision, odds calculation, reading tells pot management. She beat him on the 3rd day with a hand she'd built through 4 careful rounds of misdirection, and the look on his face was worth more than the theoretical pot. You've been doing that on purpose, he said. Losing deliberately to make you feel like a good teacher's absolutely. She spread her cards on the table. And now you know I can do it, which means you can never be sure which version of me you're playing. Something genuinely amused moved through his expression. That's ruthless. That's survival. She taught him a card game her mother had learned from French trappers. In her youth, complicated and quick with rules that shifted based on the score, and laughed when he kept forgetting the mechanics. Nobody's memory is that bad, she said. Maybe I just like watching you explain things. He said it without weight, casually, the way a person says something true, without entirely meaning to. And then he looked away, gathering the cards with hands that moved just slightly too quickly, and said it was getting late and they should turn in. Elara sat with that for a moment after he'd gone. Then she put it away carefully in the same drawer where she'd put the Derringer and went to bed. The storm broke on the fourth day, revealing a world scrubbed clean and startling in its clarity. They went out to check the cattle and found everything intact, though the garden had taken a beating. Waterlogged plants listing sideways, a row of tomatoes knocked flat by the wind. Elara spent the afternoon working the garden back into order, coaxing waterlogged roots into better positions, repacking soil around stems. Seth dug drainage channels to redirect excess water away from the beds. They worked side by side in the thin afternoon light, conversation moving easily between them. You've got a gift for that, he observed, watching her work. Plants want to live, same as anything else. You just have to give them what they need and get out of the way. She patted soil around a tomato plant and looked up at him. People are the same, I think. Given safety, given enough space, most find their way to thriving. Is that what you're doing, thriving? She considered it honestly. I'm surviving right now. Thriving might come later. Fair enough. He moved to help her with a stubborn squash plant that had wrapped its roots around a rock. For what it's worth, you seem different than you did in Redstone Crossing. Less like you're bracing for the next disaster. I feel different. She sat back on her heels, looking at the mountains in the late afternoon light. It's strange, I'm technically someone's wife now, which is supposed to make a woman more dependent, more constrained, but this feels like the opposite of that. Because it is the opposite. Seth settled back on his heels too, looking at her. You're here because you chose to be, not because you had no other option, because when you weighed the options, you picked this one. Choice changes everything. She thought about that as the light faded and they walked back toward the cabin, their footsteps falling into an unconscious synchronization she only noticed because it felt natural rather than deliberate. That night, lying awake in the dark with the creek running below and the mountains standing guard outside, Elara let herself admit something she'd been carefully refusing to look at directly. She didn't dread the year ahead. She was against every reasonable expectation and several years of evidence suggesting the world had no interest in giving her anything good. Curious about it. She fell asleep thinking about what came next rather than what she was running from. It was the first time she'd done that in longer than she could remember. September arrived wearing golden rust in the aspens, and with it came a shift that Elara couldn't quite name, but felt acutely the way temperature changes before a storm pressure building in the air without yet breaking into weather. They had settled into each other. That was the most accurate way to describe it. Not dramatically, not through any single conversation that rearranged everything, but gradually and inevitably, the way two people who spend enough time in a small space begin to accommodate the shape of the other. Seth moved around her in the kitchen without her having to cue him. She knew which silences meant he was thinking and which ones meant he was tired. He'd started leaving the coffee slightly stronger because he'd noticed she preferred it that way without her ever having said so. It should have been unremarkable. Instead, it felt like something she needed to be careful about. One morning, watching him work at the corral from the kitchen window, Elara told herself firmly 1 year. 1 year, and then she would be free. $500, an open road, and a future that was entirely her own choosing. That was the deal, and the deal was good, and she had no business letting comfort soften its edges. Then Seth looked up and caught her watching through the glass, and instead of looking away, she raised her coffee cup in a small acknowledgement, and he gave a slight nod back, and she had to set the cup down because her hands had gone unreliable. Careful, she told herself. Be careful. She threw herself into practical work instead. The root cellar needed proper organizing before winter. The cabin's log chinking had gaps that would let cold air in once the temperatures dropped hard. The chicken coop needed reinforcement. She learned which trails connected to which watershed, which weather signs meant snow within 24 hours, how to read a horse's mood before it became a problem. Seth, for his part, turned out to be a more patient teacher than she would have expected from a man of few words. He had a way of explaining things once clearly and then stepping back to let her figure out the application herself, trusting her to get it right, which was more respect than most people had ever extended to her. He taught her to shoot the Winchester properly one afternoon in late September, setting up targets on the fence rails at the far end of the clearing. She'd handled guns before her father's old rifle, the shotgun, by the door, but not with this kind of instruction. Seth positioned her stance with brief, impersonal adjustments, correcting her grip, her breathing, the angle of her shoulders. "Don't fight the recoil," he said. "Work with it. The gun's going to do what it does. Your job is to be ready for it." She hit the second target cleanly on the fourth shot. "Good," he said, and the single word was worth more than a page of compliments would have been. "You sound surprised." "I'm not," he reloaded for her without being asked. "I expected you to be good at this. You pay attention." "I've had to. Most people don't bother." He handed the rifle back. "Most people sleepwalk through their lives and then wonder why nothing they do sticks. You watch, you adjust. That's the skill that matters more than aim or speed." Elara considered this, lining up the next shot. "You sound like you're describing survival." "That's what it is." She pulled the trigger. The target jumped. "What do my actions tell you?" she asked. Seth tilted his head slightly. "What? You study people. I've watched you do it. What do mine tell you about me?" He was quiet for a moment, not avoiding the question. She was learning the difference, but taking it seriously. "They tell me you're someone who's been underestimated so long, you've almost started to believe it yourself," he said, "and that you're figuring out slowly that you were wrong too." The straightforwardness of it hit her somewhere undefended. She lined up the next shot to give herself something to do with the feeling. 10 days later, Seth mentioned the supply run. "There's a trading post about 30 miles south," he said over supper. "Man named Frank Abner runs it. Good man, fair prices. We need to make a trip before the first hard snowflower coffee lamp oil, enough to carry us through the winter." She raised an eyebrow. "I assumed you'd go alone." "Not a chance," he shook his head with a finality that left no room for negotiation. "Holt still has money and men. Leaving you here alone isn't something I'm willing to do. You can't watch over me indefinitely." "Not indefinitely. Just until we know Holt's given up, or until we've dealt with the situation another way." He met her eyes across the table. "You go where I go until then." That's not negotiable. The casual certainty of his protectiveness should have chafed. It didn't. There was a difference she was learning between possession and protection, between the way Holt had looked at her as something to be secured and the way Seth talked about her safety as something he'd chosen to be responsible for. The difference was in the choosing. It was always in the choosing. "When do we leave?" she asked. "Day after tomorrow. Pack light. 2 days there, half a day at the post, 2 days back should have us home before any early snow." That night, Elara lay in her bed, making lists, supplies needed, weights to be carried, distances involved, and found beneath the practical planning something she hadn't quite expected. Anticipation. Not just for the supplies or the brief glimpse of civilization, but for 2 more days on the trail with Seth, talking and learning and existing in the particular easy silence that had become one of the better parts of her days. She caught herself anticipating it and promptly told herself that was a perfectly normal thing to feel about a journey and meant nothing whatsoever about anything. They left at dawn, the horse's breath misting in the cold morning air. Seth had packed with military efficiency provisions, ammunition, the Winchester within easy reach in the saddle scabbard. Elara noticed he wore his gun lower on his hip than usual, tied down for a faster draw. "Expecting trouble?" she asked. "Always expect trouble. That way you are never surprised when it arrives." He scanned the tree line with steady, practiced eyes. Holt's had 6 weeks to think about what happened. Men like him don't absorb humiliation without a response they plan. "You think he'd follow us all the way out here?" "I think he has enough money to hire men who'd follow us to the end of the territory if the price was right." He clicked his horse forward onto the trail. "But tracking is one thing. Catching us in country where I know every approach and hiding spot, that's another problem entirely for them." The country they rode through was weld, and various pine forests giving way to meadow, to granite outcropping, streams running cold and clear in the sunlight. Seth narrated as they went, pointing out landmarks with the tone of a man sharing things he'd learned alone and had been waiting without quite knowing it for someone to share them with. "See that split boulder up there that marks the turn toward Miller Creek? Miss that turn, you end up in Box Canyon. No water, no exit, except back the way you came. He gestured toward three peaks lined up on the eastern horizon. Those three lined up like that point toward an old trapper's cabin about 15 miles off. Abandoned now, but the roof's still solid. Good shelter in a fast storm. Elara committed it all to memory. She was aware that he was teaching her not just geography, but escape routes. Specific practical paths she could take alone if something happened to him. It was a kind of trust she hadn't been offered before, the trust of someone saying, here is what you need to not need me. They stopped at midday beside a clear stream, resting the horses and eating from their saddlebags. Elara filled her canteen in the cold water, watching light scatter across the surface. It's beautiful out here, she said. Brutal, but beautiful. That's the frontier in a nutshell. Seth stretched out on a flat rock hat, tilted over his eyes against the noon glare. Kills you without thinking twice about it, but shows you something worth seeing while it's doing it. Is that why you stayed? The contradiction? He was quiet long enough that she counted her heartbeats. Then, without moving the hat, I stayed because I understood it. The violence and the beauty side by side that made sense to me in a way civilization stopped making after the war. A pause. I tried going back to normal life, got a job in a lumber mill, rented a room in town, went through the motions, but every night I'd dream about things I'd done, and every morning I'd wake up feeling like I was wearing someone else's skin. Elara pulled up a stem of grass, turning it in her fingers. My mother used to say that civilization was just the agreement to pretend we're not animals, that underneath all the manners and social rules, we're still creatures fighting for survival. She was right. Seth sat up, pushing the hat back. Most honest thing anyone's ever said about it. She was a realistic woman. She saw the world for what it was rather than what she wished it could be. Elara set down the grass. Sometimes I wonder if that realism was what killed her. If she looked at the influenza and decided she was too tired to keep fighting it. Seth was looking at her with careful attention. You think she chose to go? I know she did. I was there. I saw the way she looked at the medicine the doctor left and the way she decided not to take it. She was done, and she let go. Elara met his eyes. It used to make me furious. I was angry for years that she'd leave us, that she'd break her promise to stay strong. And now I think maybe I understand it better. Sometimes fighting isn't brave. Sometimes it's just exhausting. And sometimes the bravest thing is admitting you're through. Seth said nothing for a moment. The creek ran past them indifferent and clear. Is that how you feel? He asked. Through no. The answer came quickly, surprising her with its certainty. I'm tired, but I'm not done. I've got 11 months to figure out who I am when I'm not constantly defending myself against something. And I'll be damned if I waste that chance. She stood, brushing dust from her skirt. Come on, we're burning daylight. Frank Abner's trading post appeared just past noon, a sprawling collection of log buildings, main store, and stable and bunkhouse smoke rising from multiple chimneys. The proprietor himself came out to meet them, a barrel-chested man in his 50s with a magnificent gray beard and the sharp assessing eyes of someone who'd been reading People for Profit for 30 years. Calloway. His handshake was solid. Been a while. Heard you got yourself married. He looked at Elara with frank curiosity. Didn't believe it until just now. News travels fast, Seth said. News about you taking on Warren Holt travels faster than most. Abner turned to Elara with a nod that managed to be both respectful and frankly interested. Frank Abner, ma'am, at your service. Any woman brave enough to marry this particular hermit has my full respect. Elara Calloway. She shook his hand. The hermit is growing on me. Something surprised moved across Seth's face. Abner grinned and gestured toward the store. Come inside. I'll get you provisioned and tell you what else I've heard. The trading post interior was dense with goods, flour, coffee, canned goods, tools, ammunition, fabric, bolts, items ranging from the purely functional to the surprisingly luxurious. Abner poured coffee while Elara began working through her supply list. Holt's been making noise, Abner said blunt as a fence post. Word is he's put up $500 for information leading to your location. Another $1,000 for whoever brings Mrs. Calloway back to Redstone Crossing alive. He looked at Seth over the rim of his cup. Notice he didn't specify her condition. Seth's coffee cup settled onto the counter with a controlled quietness. He came here personally, Abner continued. about 2 weeks back, asked the same questions his men had been asking before him. But there was something else too. He was asking about marriage law, annulments, whether a marriage could be challenged if one party was coerced. What did you tell him? Told him I wasn't a lawyer and he should take his questions elsewhere. But he's building a case for something. Abner shook his head. Man's not just angry, he's planning. And a man with money who's planning is considerably more dangerous than a man with money who's just furious. How many men does he have working for him now? Rumor puts it at 8 hired guns, some from as far as Cheyenne, top dollar men. Abner met his eyes. He's not going to let this go, Seth. I know. Do you know what you're going to do about it? Keep living my life, protect what's mine, wait for him to make a move, and finish it when he does. Abner looked at Elara, who was pretending to study a bolt of blue calico while clearly listening to every word. For what it's worth, Abner said, dropping his voice slightly, I've got friends through the territory, people who owe me favors and don't care much for bullies. I'll put out word that anyone feeding Holt information about you makes an enemy of me. He rang up their purchases with a measuring look at Seth. That's $43 even, and that fabric your wife's been studying, consider that a wedding gift. Frank, don't argue with me. Every home needs something beautiful. It's a fact. He folded the calico and added it to their pile. Besides, you two are going to need every advantage you can get. As they loaded their horses in the yard, Abner came to the stable door with one final thing. Seth, his tone was different now, serious in a way that cut through the easy manner. Holt was here personally because he's not delegating anymore. When a man like that stops sending others and starts moving himself, that's when you need to be watching every direction at once. Seth tightened the last strap on his saddlebag. I hear you. Make sure you do. They rode north in a silence that had weight to it, the earlier easy conversation of the trail replaced by something more measured. Elara processed what she'd heard, turning it over against the mountains that rose on 3 sides of them, beautiful and cold and indifferent. He's not going to stop, she said at last. No. Seth's voice was flat. Men like Holt don't stop, they escalate. Maybe I should just go, disappear east somewhere he can't reach me. That way you're not in danger. No. The word was immediate and absolute. That's exactly what he wants to isolate you, make you vulnerable. And we made a deal. 1 year. I intend to honor it. Even if honoring it gets you killed. He glanced at her sideways. I've been in worse positions with worse odds. I'm not planning to die. A beat. I'm planning to end this, so we can both live in peace. But that means standing our ground, not running. They made camp that night in a defensible position. Seth chose with tactical care, back against a cliff face, clear sight lines in 3 directions. No fire. They ate cold rations in gathering darkness, and Elara lay awake long after Seth's breathing had steadied into sleep, staring at stars that were cold and clear and very far away. She thought about the blue calico folded in her pack, a wedding gift Abner had called it for a wedding that was supposed to be temporary. She thought about the way Seth had said my wife to Abner so easily, so without performance, like it was simply true. She thought about staying and she thought about leaving, and she couldn't make herself want the leaving in the clean, simple way she'd expected to when she'd agreed to this. That's winter isolation and proximity, she told herself firmly. That's gratitude. That's the absence of threat making everything else feel like warmth by comparison. She told herself that carefully and repeatedly until she finally slept. She didn't entirely believe it. They reached home the following afternoon without incident, though Seth swept the property for signs of intrusion before he relaxed even slightly. Inside the cabin, Elara unpacked their supplies while Seth made a final check of the outbuildings. When he came back, some of the tightness in his posture had eased. We're secure, he said. For now. For now. She put the last of the flour away and turned to face him. Seth? He looked at her. Thank you. She held his gaze. For all of this, the trip, the supply, standing up to Holt again, forgiving me. She stopped, looked for the right word. Forgiving me a year to figure out who I am. Something moved through his expression, not the shuttered control she'd first learned to read, but something underneath it, something he wasn't quite managing to hold back. You don't have to thank me, he said. This is what I agreed to. I know. I'm thanking you anyway. She turned back to the shelf, organizing coffee tins with more precision than strictly necessary. I don't regret it, any of it. There was a pause before he answered. Neither do I. The words were quiet, but the weight behind them was something she felt in the center of her chest and couldn't quite set down. She didn't try to. October arrived with the first snow, a light dusting that melted by noon, but carried in it the unmistakable announcement of what was coming. Elara woke to frost patterns on the window glass and found Seth already outside splitting firewood in the crisp morning air, his breath rising in white clouds that dissipated against the pale sky. She watched him for longer than she meant to. Then she poured 2 cups of coffee and went out to the porch. He looked up when she appeared, and something in his face relaxed the way it had started doing when he saw her. Something she'd started noticing and then making herself stop noticing with limited success. Storm coming, he said, accepting the coffee. Big one, signs are right. We've got maybe 48 hours before it hits. How bad? Could be a week, could be 2. He wrapped both hands around the cup. Winters up here don't follow schedules. They spent the next 2 days in frenzied preparation, moving with the particular urgency of people who understood exactly what it meant to be unprepared when the mountains decided to make a point. Seth reinforced the barn, checked the coop, secured the cattle in the high pasture shelter. Elara reorganized the pantry, checked and doubled their lamp oil stores, baked bread that could last days, and prepared stews that could be reheated without attention. She filled every container in the cabin with water against the possibility of the well freezing. At one point, she found herself stacking wood by the inner hearth wall, while Seth chinked a gap in the cabin logs she'd noticed the week before, and they worked in a silence so comfortable it almost frightened her. She'd spent most of her adult life either alone or fighting to hold ground against someone. This partnership, this unconscious synchronization was something she had no name for in her experience. The storm hit on the third night with a violence that was almost personal. Wind screamed around the cabin like something alive, rattling shutters, forcing cold fingers through every gap. Snow fell so thick that by midnight the lower windows were already half obscured. Seth banked the fire and checked the cabin's integrity with the systematic calm of a man who'd made peace with conditions he couldn't control, and Elara found herself drawing steadiness from his steadiness in a way she couldn't entirely account for. "This is normal up here," he said over the roar of the wind. "Normal," she repeated. "Wait until January." They were trapped inside for 3 solid days. Seth taught her chess using pieces he'd carved from scrap pine during his first winter, a lone rough but functional, each piece identifiable by its distinctive shape. He turned out to be a ruthless player who showed no mercy in the teaching of it, which Elara found she respected. There was something honest about playing without condescension. She won on the 6th game by sacrificing her queen in a move that left him staring at the board for nearly a minute before he acknowledged it. "You've been studying this," he said, "since game 3. I figured out your approach and started working backward from it." She rearranged the pieces for another round. "You play very logically, which means you can be predicted by someone willing to think 4 moves further than you expect. That's a dangerous skill. Most useful things are." He looked at her with something that was not quite amusement and not quite admiration, but lived in the neighborhood of both. She taught him the French trapper's card game her mother had learned on the Missouri River, and laughed genuinely, the kind of laughter that comes from somewhere unguarded, when he kept mixing up the shifting rule sets. "Nobody's memory is this bad," she said. "Maybe I just like watching you explain things." He said it easily, casually, and then looked at his cards with exaggerated focus, as if he hadn't said anything in particular. But Elara heard it, and didn't look away this time. The storm broke on the 4th day. They emerged to a world made entirely new snow, in smooth, massive drifts that had erased the familiar landmarks and replaced them with clean white curves. The sky overhead a painful, brilliant blue. "Beautiful," Elara said, standing in the doorway, "and 10 below at least. Probably colder with the wind chill." Seth pulled on heavy gloves. "Stay inside. I need to check the livestock, and I need you warm enough to be useful if something went wrong." She wanted to argue. She was learning when that impulse was worth acting on and when it wasn't. She stayed inside and watched through the window and tried not to feel the particular quality of worry that settled in her chest when Seth's figure disappeared into the white distance. He came back an hour later, half frozen with the news that the animals were fine and they'd lost part of the coop roof, but the hens had survived. "We're in good shape," he said, stripping off snow-crusted layers by the fire. "Could stay snowed in for a month if we had to. Let's hope it doesn't come to that. Don't count on it." He poured coffee and wrapped both hands around the mug, and she found herself studying the lines of fatigue in his face. Not the sharp-edged wariness she'd first learned to read there, but something older and more settled, the residue of a hard life that had eventually improbably led somewhere worth being. She looked away before he could catch her at it. It was a night in the second week of the snowbound period when she finally heard him wake from a nightmare. A gasp, sharp and controlled, a man disciplined enough to contain it, even half asleep, and then the creak of floorboards as he rose. She lay still in her room, listening to him pace slow and methodical, the same route each time, to the window, back to the hearth, to the door, back to the window. As if he could walk the distance between the dream and the waking world. After 20 minutes, she got up. She found him at the window staring out at moonlit snow. His expression and profile was the most open she'd ever seen it, unguarded, in the way a person is when they don't know they're being watched, all the careful architecture of control temporarily set aside. "Can't sleep?" she asked softly. He turned, not startled. He'd heard her. She suspected the moment she stepped out of her room. "Didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't, not exactly." She moved to stand beside him at the window. The snow outside lay in silver and shadow, perfectly still, the world reduced to the size of what the moonlight could reach. "Bad ones?" she asked. "Same ones I always have." He exhaled slowly. "War, fire, screaming." His voice was flat, not because he didn't feel it, but because he'd spent years learning to carry it at a distance. "Nothing new. Do you want to talk about it?" "Talking doesn't make it go away." "No, but it might make it less heavy." She kept her voice even, offering without pushing. "Shared weight is easier to carry." He was quiet for a long time. Outside, something shifted in the snowdrift against the window, settling, exhaling, and then went still again. "There was a town in Georgia," Seth said at last. "I can't remember its name anymore. We burned it." He paused. "Sherman's orders. Total war. Destroy anything that could sustain the Confederate war effort. We gave warning, told people to get out. Some did, some couldn't." His hands tightened on the window frame. "I can still hear them. Still smell the smoke. The worst part is..." He stopped. "The worst part is what?" "The worst part is that I do it again. If I were 17 and a soldier and given the same orders by men I'd been trained to obey, I'd do it again. Because that's what soldiers do. They follow orders even when those orders are monstrous. And then they come home and try to be people again and discover the two things don't fit inside the same skin." Elara reached out and placed her hand over his on the window frame, slowly, carefully, as she might approach something that needed not to be startled. He didn't pull away. "You were 17, she said, following orders from people you had been taught that it was treason to disobey." She felt the tension in his hand, the tightness that held there even in sleep. "That doesn't erase what happened, but it means the person who struck those matches isn't the same person standing here now. You've spent 10 years building instead of burning. That has to count for something." "Does it?" His voice was rough. "Or is it just penance, trying to balance the scales with enough good deeds?" "Maybe redemption isn't about balancing scales," she said quietly. "Maybe it's about what you choose when you get another chance." He turned then slowly and looked at her. Really looked at her. The moonlight fell across his face and she saw the complexity there, the damage and the decency, the scars and what had survived beneath them. "You had a chance to let Holt own me," she said. "You chose differently. You've had dozens of chances to take advantage of our arrangement. You've chosen differently every time. Those choices are who you are now, Seth, not the things you can't undo." His thumb moved across her knuckles, a gesture so gentle it nearly undid her. "When did you get this wise?" he asked. "About the time I realized that hating myself for Daniel's choices was just another way of letting him control my life." She managed something close to a smile. "We're both carrying weight we didn't ask for. Maybe we can help each other carry it. Maybe we can." She pulled her hand back slowly, acutely aware of how close they were standing, how easy it would be to close the remaining distance, how much she wanted to, and how carefully she was not going to. "Try to sleep," she said. "Morning comes early, and we've got fence repairs when the weather breaks." She returned to her room, closed the door softly, and lay staring at the ceiling with her heart beating harder than the cold could account for. She told herself it was concern. She told herself it was proximity. She told herself it was the natural result of two isolated people in close quarters during a long winter. She told herself all of it and believed almost none of it. The weather broke 2 days later, and they threw themselves into the work of recovery and repair. Seth checked the outer fence line while Elara salvaged what she could of the winter garden. They worked side by side with the ease of people who had learned each other's rhythms, knowing when to hand a tool before being asked, knowing when silence was better than commentary. "You're good at this," Seth observed, watching her work a half-drowned carrot bed back into order, knowing when to intervene and when to let things find their own way. "I've had practice telling the difference between helping and interfering. Most people don't bother with the distinction." She sat back on her heels, brushing dirt from her palms. "Seth, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." He set down his tools and gave her his full attention. "When you came to the saloon that night," she said, "when you made the offer, was any part of it about wanting company? Was any part of it about you and not just about doing the right thing?" He held her gaze for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "The ranch was too quiet, had been for 3 years. I told myself it was what I wanted. Solitude. No explanations owed to anyone." He paused. "When I saw you stand up to Holt, I thought there's someone who doesn't flinch. And I thought about what it might be like to have that in my life. Not just a transaction, but someone worth talking to." He picked up his tools again, matter of fact. "So yes, part of it was selfish." Elara looked at him. "Thank you for admitting that. You asked for honesty." "I did." She turned back to the garden. "For what it's worth, I think that's the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me about wanting me around." He didn't answer immediately, but when she looked up a few moments later, he was watching her with an expression that made the breath catch in her chest. Then he looked back at the fence post he was setting, and the moment closed. The confession came in December. They were sitting by the fire on an evening that had gone quiet and close around them, the wind outside nothing more than a low murmur against the cabin walls. Seth had been mending a piece of harness. Elara had been sewing from the blue calico Abner had given them, making curtains for the front windows. The kind of evening that had become its own kind of normal. "There's something I need to tell you," Seth said. She looked up from her work. "I've been thinking about what happens when the year ends." He set the harness aside, his eyes on the fire. "And I want you to know, truly know, that you are free to go. If that's your choice, no pressure, no guilt. I'll keep every word I gave you about the settlement and the help getting set up wherever you want." "But," she said, "but," he met her eyes. "I also want you to know that if you chose to stay, that would be more than acceptable." The words sat between them in the firelight. "You're saying you want me to stay," she said. "I'm saying I've gotten used to having you here, used to conversations and shared meals, and someone to care about beyond just myself." Something vulnerable moved through his expression there and gone. "The cabin feels empty when you're not in it. I find myself thinking about improvements to this place with you in mind, what you'd like, what would make it better for both of us, not just for me." He held her gaze. "But this is your choice, completely and entirely yours. I'm not asking you to decide tonight or next month or even before the year is up. I just wanted you to know that staying is an option, if you want it." Elara looked at him, this scarred, careful, deeply decent man who had offered her a way out when she'd had none and kept every promise since, and was now offering her something she hadn't known she was missing. "Can I think about it?" she asked. "Take all the time you need." She nodded. "Good night, Seth." "Good night, Elara." She lay awake that night, listening to the familiar sounds of the cabin, the fire settling the distant creek, and Seth moving quietly in his room on the other side of the wall. She already knew her answer, had known it, she thought, for longer than she'd been willing to admit. But the knowing and the saying were different things. The knowing was private, the saying was a choice, and she wanted to choose it clearly with open eyes and a steady hand, not under the influence of winter darkness and firelight, in the specific kind of longing that came from being near someone who treated you like you mattered. She would choose in the morning, she told herself. Then the morning came and she chose to wait one more day and then another. Because she had learned something about herself in the past months, she was not someone who moved quickly toward things that mattered. She moved carefully. She tested the ground before she stepped, and what lay ahead of her felt like ground worth testing carefully. The rider came 2 days before Christmas. Seth spotted him from the window. A figure struggling through fresh snow on a horse that was running on the last of its strength, moving with the desperate urgency of someone who'd been pushing too hard for too long. He had his rifle in hand before Elara fully registered the sound of hoofbeats. "Stay inside," he said. "Bar the door behind me. If shooting starts, the root cellar don't come out until I come for you." "Seth, Elara." His eyes met hers, steady and absolute. "I need you safe so I can move without worrying about you. Trust me." She barred the door and watched through the window with her heart lodged somewhere in her throat. The rider nearly fell, dismounting, catching the saddle at the last moment with both hands. Up close, he was barely 20, a boy, really in clothes far too thin for the weather, his lips going blue, his hands shaking visibly from a distance. Not one of Holt's hired men. Something else entirely. She watched Seth speak to him. Watched the young man gesture frantically back the way he'd come. Watched Seth lower the rifle and help him toward the barn first, then to the cabin. She had the door unbarred before they reached the porch. The young man's name was James Harding. Frank Abner had sent him. Elara got him to the fire and wrapped in blankets while Seth made coffee, and between the two of them, they brought him back from the edge of hypothermia in about 40 minutes. By the time he could speak without his teeth chattering, the color had returned to his face and some of the desperate urgency had steadied into simple seriousness. "Mr. Abner sent me," he said. "He said you needed to know. Holt is making his move." Seth's voice was very quiet. "How many men?" "At least 12, maybe more. Hired guns, some from as far as Denver. Holt's paying top dollar." James wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. "There's a bounty 500 for information on your location. Another 1,000 for anyone who brings Mrs. Calloway back to Redstone Crossing alive." He swallowed. He didn't specify condition. "When?" Seth said. "Mr. Abner thinks they'll move after the next storm breaks. Could be 3 days, could be a week depending on weather." James looked between them. "Mr. Abner says he's gathered 5 men people who owe him and don't care for what Holt's been doing in this territory. They'll head this way as soon as the storm breaks. Should arrive maybe a day after Holt's crew." He hesitated. "He says to hold on until then. Use the land." Seth was already at the window looking out at the landscape with the calculating attention of a man mentally converting it into a battlefield. 5 against 12 was bad arithmetic on a flat plain. In mountain terrain, he knew intimately with another 5 reinforcements arriving inside 24 hours, the calculation changed substantially. "You'll stay here until you're strong enough to ride back," Seth told James. "There's a line shack 5 miles east you can shelter in and wait for the weather to break before making for Abner's." James nodded. "And you?" "We prepare." Elara met Seth's eyes across the room. "We prepare," she said. The next 2 days moved with the particular intensity of time that knows it's running out. Seth showed Elara every escape route from the ranch, every trail that could carry her to safety, without crossing open ground, every landmark and turning point she'd need to navigate alone in bad weather. He drilled her on the Winchester until she could hit moving targets reliably, until her hands stopped shaking after the shot, until the mechanics of it became reflex rather than thought. They worked together on the cabin's defensive positions, reinforcing the shutters, identifying fields of fire from each window, establishing protocols for what each of them would do when the shooting started. "If I tell you to run," Seth said on the second afternoon, "you run. No arguments, no hesitation. And if I tell you the same thing, Howling," he looked at her steadily, "then I've already been shot." "That's not funny." "It wasn't meant to be." He held her gaze. "Promise me, Elara. If the situation breaks badly, you take the escape route we mapped and you ride hard for Abner's. You let Tucker's people help you get somewhere Holt can't reach." She wanted to argue. She wanted to say she wasn't going to leave him. She wanted to say that the arrangement they'd built together, this careful, improbable, deeply real thing, was worth more than her safe departure. "I promise," she said, "if you promise to survive." "I'm planning on it." "Then plan harder." Something moved through his face, something complicated and warm and briefly unguarded. Then he went back to checking the rifle sights, and she went back to counting ammunition, and the practical work of preparation carried them through the rest of the afternoon. James Harding left on the third morning, steadier now, headed for the line shack with enough provisions to wait out the next storm before making for Abner's post. He shook Seth's hand before he mounted. "Mr. Abner believes in you," the young man said. "Says if anyone can hold Holt accountable for what he's done to this territory, it's you." Tell Frank I owe him more than I can repay. He says you don't owe him anything. Says he's just tired of watching the wrong people win. After James disappeared into the trees, Seth stood in the yard for a long moment, looking north toward the mountains. Elara came to stand beside him. "It's going to be all right," she said. She wasn't sure she believed it completely, but she said it like she did because that was what the moment required. "Yes," Seth said, "it is." He said it the same way, and she suspected they were both doing the same thing, choosing the version of the future they were willing to fight for. Goodbye. The predicted storm hit the following night. It came with savage conviction wind that turned the world outside into a single white roar, snow so thick it seemed to have weight and intention. Elara lay beside Seth in the darkness, fully clothed, listening to the cabin absorb the force of it, and tried to hold on to the knowledge that the storm, however violent, was buying them time. "Tell me something," she said into the darkness. "Something about before Wyoming, before the war even." Seth was quiet for a moment. "My mother had a garden," he said finally. "Back in Missouri, she grew sweet peas along the fence every summer. I used to think that was the most pointless thing in the world, spending effort on flowers when we barely had enough for food. Then she died, and I never saw sweet peas again, and I understood." A pause. She was growing them for herself because she needed beauty to keep going. Because survival alone isn't enough, you need something worth surviving for. Elara thought about her own mother's roses, the way they'd planted and failed and planted again season after season in soil that was almost always wrong and wind that was almost always too harsh. "My mother planted roses," she said, "every year. Most of them died. She kept trying anyway." Sounds like she understood the same thing mine did. Maybe that's where I learned it. She turned her head slightly on the pillow, looking at the outline of his face in the darkness. "What are you growing now, Seth? What's your sweet peas?" The silence stretched long enough that she thought he might not answer. "This," he said quietly. "What we've built here. This is what I'm growing." She reached for his hand under the blanket and held it, and he held hers back, and neither of them said anything else for a long time. The storm broke on his fifth day, leaving behind the same crystalline silence and brutal cold as before. They moved through the morning with calm efficiency, not the frantic urgency of the days before James arrived, but the focused quiet of people who had made their peace with what was coming and were ready to meet it. Seth positioned himself at the main window just before noon. Elara was at the second window. The rifles were loaded and close. The escape pack was by the back door. She spotted them before he did, 12 riders moving up the southern approach in loose formation, exactly as Seth had predicted they would. At the front, incongruous in his fine suit, and with Pike at his shoulder, rode Warren Holt. Even at a distance, the fury coming off him was visible. "Calloway," Holt's voice carried clean across the frozen air. "I know you're inside. Come out and let's end this like civilized people." Seth opened the window a crack. "You're trespassing on private land. Turn your men around and ride out while you still can. Your wife was promised to me. The law's on my side. The law is on the side of the man who paid the debt. That's me." Seth's voice was level and very deliberate. "The debt is settled. The marriage is legal. Elara made her choice. That's the end of it. The girl doesn't get to make choices." Something in Holt's veneer had cracked all the way through. What showed underneath was ugly and absolute, the face of a man who had never genuinely accepted limits placed on him by other people. "Send her out, Calloway. My men and I ride away. You have my word." "Your word isn't worth the air it's moving through, and she's not going anywhere." From the western ridgeline, Elara caught a glint sunlight on metal, the flash of a rifle scope. "Abner's men." She exhaled. "Last chance," Holt said. "We're done talking," Seth said, and stepped back from the window. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Holt nodded, and his men charged. The first volley came from both directions, from Seth at the main window and from the western ridge where Abner's 5 men had positioned themselves in the night. 3 of Holt's riders went down in the initial exchange, horses screaming and bolting. The formation broke immediately, men scattering for cover behind the outbuildings and the woodpile and the remnants of the fence line. Elara tracked a man moving to flank the barn at a low run and fired. The shot caught him in the shoulder, and he went down behind a snowdrift, cursing. She reloaded without looking the way Seth had drilled her and moved to the second window. The fight was fast and merciless, and nothing like the clean, decisive engagements she'd read about in the newspapers. It was noise and smoke and the shrieking of frightened horses and the need to keep moving, keep tracking, keep her hands steady on the rifle when everything in her wanted to stop and cover her ears. 3 of Holt's men broke within the first 10 minutes, spurring their horses south without looking back. 2 more went down wounded and stopped fighting. That left 7 against 7, and Abner's men had the high ground and the discipline of people who'd been in this territory a long time and had decided finally that they'd had enough of looking the other way. "Fall back," someone on Holt's side shouted. "This isn't worth dying for." 2 more men peeled off. That left Holt with 4 against 7 who hadn't lost the will to fight. "Stand your ground," Holt screamed at his retreating men. "I'm paying you. You're not paying us enough to die for you." One of them called back and didn't stop riding. Seth stepped out onto the porch, rifle leveled. Carson, the leader of Abner's men, a former cavalry officer turned rancher, who'd been one of the first to answer Abner's call, came out from the western position. "Holt," Carson called. "It's over. Call off what's left and ride out. This ends now. Nothing ends until I say it ends." But Holt's voice had changed, the smooth, patient authority replaced by something frantic and exposed. He was a man who had built his entire identity on power, and the power was draining out of him in front of witnesses he'd once believed he owned. "You've lost your men," Seth said from the porch. "You've lost the fight, and you're going to lose everything else when this goes to the territorial marshal. The dead, the bounties, the attempted coercion. That's 10 years in a federal prison at minimum." He walked down the porch steps, crossing the snow toward Holt, with the deliberate calm of a man who has already decided how this ends. "Accept defeat with whatever dignity you have left and ride out, or raise that gun and find out what comes next." Holt's hand went to his gun. The shot came from the doorway. Elara stood with the Winchester still smoking, her hands steadier than she would have believed possible 2 minutes ago. She watched Warren Holt stagger backward, his hand flying to his shoulder where the bullet had caught him, high, clean, nothing vital, and then dropped to his knees in the snow. He looked up at her with an expression of absolute disbelief. "I'm not your property," Elara said. Her voice was quiet and final, the way water is quiet when it has finally found the lowest ground and stopped moving. "I was never your property, and I'm done being afraid of you." Holt's remaining men dropped their weapons. Carson's men moved in to secure them. Seth crossed the yard in 5 strides and was there, and she let him take the rifle from her hands because her arms had decided that was enough, and she stood in the cold air, breathing, just breathing, while he held her, and the mountain stood witness to all of it. "You saved my life," he said, his voice rough against her hair. "You would have done it anyway." "Maybe, but you were faster." He pulled back enough to look at her face. "How are you?" "Ask me in a few minutes." She let out a long, unsteady breath. "I think I'll have an opinion by then." "Swell." Carson knelt beside Holt and checked the wound with professional efficiency. "He'll live," he said. "Bullet took him clean through the shoulder muscle. He'll stand trial." He looked up at Elara with an expression that contained something like respect. "Good shooting, Mrs. Calloway. Precise. Controlled." He stood. Half the territory has been waiting for someone to do exactly that for 5 years. They spent the rest of the afternoon in the practical aftermath of violence, securing the prisoners, tending the wounded, taking stock. 2 of Holt's men were dead, 3 more wounded badly enough to require attention. The rest had either fled or surrendered. On their side, 2 of Abner's men had taken wounds that would heal in time. Carson arranged the transport of Holt and the surviving prisoners to the territorial marshal in Cheyenne the following morning. "Between Abner's testimony and everything that happened here today," he said to Seth before he left, "Holt won't see freedom for the rest of his natural life. His operation is finished. The men who worked for him will scatter. This territory is going to be a different place by spring." After they'd gone, taking the prisoners and their dead, leaving behind a silence that felt almost too large for the clearing, Seth and Elara stood together in the yard and looked at what remained. Bullet holes in the cabin walls, blood-marked snow already beginning to be covered by a light newfall. The mountains standing over all of it, patient and enormous. "It's over," Elara said. "It's over." Seth turned to look at her, and his expression was open in a way she had rarely seen, not guarded, not managed, just present. "Now we get to live." The weeks that followed were the quietest Elara had ever known. They repaired what the fight had damaged. They patched the bullet holes, replaced the fence rail that had been used for cover, cleared the last of the battle's marks from the snow. The ranch returned to itself, the particular piece of a place where hard work is the loudest sound and the mountains provide the rest. Frank Abner came to visit personally in the new year, bringing supplies and news. Holt's trial was proceeding in Cheyenne, his financial empire already beginning to disintegrate as the men who depended on his protection quietly repositioned themselves toward better odds. The sheriff who'd taken his money was facing his own inquiry. The territory was rearranging itself. "You did something that mattered," Abner told them over coffee at the kitchen table. "Not just for yourselves, for everyone who learned to look the other way, because they didn't think anyone would stand up first." He looked between them with warm, assessing eyes. "You made it possible to believe things could be different." Daniel arrived 2 weeks later. He rode up in the late morning, hat in hand, his face carrying a quality she hadn't seen in him before. Something earned, something chastened. Nothing of the boyish deflection that had always been his first resort. She met him in the yard. "I heard what happened," he said. "What you did, what you both did." He couldn't quite meet her eyes. "Elara, I—" "Don't apologize," she said. "Don't explain. I've heard enough of both from you over the years to know what they cost and what they're worth." He flinched. "That's fair. I'm not angry anymore," she said. "I was for a long time, but I'm not. What you did was wrong, and it was cowardly, and it almost destroyed me." She held his gaze steadily. "It also led me here, and here is—" She paused, looked back at the cabin where Seth was visible through the window, working at the table. "Here is the best thing that's ever happened to me. So in a strange way, I suppose I owe you something for it." Daniel's expression crumpled slightly. "You don't owe me a thing." "No, I don't." She almost smiled. "I'm working at the lumber mill," he said. "Steady work, hard work, honest pay." He straightened slightly. "I'm trying to be someone you could be proud of. I don't know if I'll get there." "Keep trying," she said. "Keep showing up. The trying is what matters." She watched him ride out and felt finally the last of the weight lift from her shoulders. Not all at once, not dramatically, but cleanly. Like a door being closed on a room she didn't need to live in anymore. Seth was standing in the doorway when she turned back toward the cabin. "You all right?" he asked. "I'm free," she said. "Actually, completely free. For the first time." He held out his hand. She took it. On an evening in late January, with snow falling softly past the windows and the fire burning with easy warmth, Seth came to the kitchen table where Elara was writing a letter to a woman she'd known in Redstone Crossing, one of the few who'd shown her small kindnesses in the maze before everything changed. He set a small wooden box on the table beside her paper. She looked up. "Open it," he said. Inside the box lay a ring, plain gold engraved with running wildflowers. The same ones that grew in the meadow below the cabin in July, the ones she'd picked for the kitchen table every week since she'd arrived. The carving was fine and careful, the work of many hours and considerable love. Her breath caught. "We got married out of necessity," Seth said. He lowered himself to one knee beside her chair, unhurried, certain a man who had made his peace with what he was about to say. "Out of desperation and bad options and a leather pouch of gold. That's not what this is anymore. It hasn't been for months." He met her eyes. "I'm asking you now, not because of a contract, not because of Holt, not because of anyone or anything but this." His voice was steady and warm and utterly without performance. "I love you, Elara. I love your strength and your stubbornness and the way you reorganized my kitchen so everything finally made sense. I love the way you fight for things and the way you rest when fighting is finished. I love everything about who you've become in this place and everything I can see of who you're still becoming." He held out the ring. "Will you marry me for real this time? By choice." Tears moved down her face before she decided to cry. She had thought once that freedom meant departure, meant open road and a train ticket east and a life entirely untethered from anything she hadn't chosen from scratch. She had spent months protecting that idea from the warmth and weight and specific irreplaceable reality of what she'd actually found. She looked at Seth Calloway, this scarred patient, deeply decent man who had offered her a way out when she had none and kept every promise since, and was now asking her to choose not departure, but arrival. And she understood finally what freedom actually was. Not the absence of attachment, the presence of choice. "Yes," she said. "Yes. 100 times yes." He slid the ring onto her finger beside the plain band from their first wedding. She pulled him up from his knee and kissed him with everything she had, and he kissed her back and with all the restrained, patient, quietly enormous love that she now understood had been there since before either of them had been willing to name it. They married again in April when the snow was gone and the meadow below the cabin had its first green, and the sweet peas Seth had planted along the fence line were just beginning to push through the soil. Frank Abner officiated with Carson and his men as witnesses along with neighbors from ranches throughout the valley who come not out of obligation, but out of genuine celebration for the couple who'd stood up to Warren Holt and given everyone else permission to believe things could be different. Daniel came sober and quiet. He sat at the back and watched his sister marry the man who'd saved her with visible, complicated emotion that he didn't try to explain and she didn't ask him to. The vows were simple. They meant every word. This time when the ceremony ended, when Seth kissed her in front of everyone who'd come to witness it, was nothing like the brief formal touch of their first ceremony. It was a statement, a declaration, a promise made in full understanding of what it would require and full willingness to give it. The celebration lasted into the evening, and when the last guest had gone and the yard was quiet and the stars were coming out over the mountains, Elara and Seth stood together in the dark and looked at what they'd built. A ranch, a home, a partnership tested by violence and winter, and the worst that other people's cruelty could devise, and emerged not just intact but stronger than it had begun. Happy? Seth asked. More than I knew was possible, she said. A year ago, I thought my life was ending. I thought everything I'd been promised had been taken away and there was nothing left. She turned to look at him. Instead, I got this. I got you. I got a life I actually chose. A year ago, I was half alive, he said, going through the motions, convinced I was too broken to deserve more than solitude. He brought her hand to his mouth and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, slow and deliberate. You walked into my livery stable and reminded me what it felt like to want something. We saved each other, she said. We saved each other, he agreed. And we're going to keep doing it every day for the rest of our lives. Above them, the April sky was vast and clear and full of stars, the same stars that had wheeled over them on that first desperate night right out of Redstone Crossing over all the storms, since over every conversation and every choice and every moment that had led improbably and inevitably to this one. Elara Calloway leaned into the warmth of her husband's side. She had been bartered. She had been threatened. She had been given no choices at all, and then one terrible choice, and then through the strange and painful grace of how things sometimes work, everything else. She had burned every bridge she'd ever stood on, and she had found on the other side solid ground. The mountains stood over them in silence, patient witnesses as the last light left the sky and the stars burned on. And in the cabin behind them, the fire was already lit warm against the dark, waiting for them to come home.